The wind howled through the skeletal trees, clawing at the last remnants of autumn leaves as Mia Grayson steered her beat-up hatchback down the winding road. The GPS had died an hour ago, its screen frozen on a jagged map of rural Pennsylvania, leaving her with only a crumpled note from her estranged uncle, "Find Hollow's End. It's waiting for you." She hadn't seen Uncle Elias in years, not since he'd vanished into the woods after her mother's funeral, muttering about the hollow and the voices. Now, his cryptic letter had arrived at her doorstep, stained with something dark and smelling faintly of damp earth. Against her better judgment, she'd packed a bag and driven north. The road narrowed, asphalt crumbling into gravel, then dirt. The forest loomed closer, its gnarled branches scraping the car like bony fingers. Ahead, a rusted sign swung crookedly on a single chain, Hollow's End, Pop 43. The number had been scratched out, replaced with a smeared, illegible scrawl. Mia's stomach twisted. She should have turned back, but the note burned in her pocket, urging her on. The town, if it could be called that, emerged from the mist like a mirage. A handful of dilapidated houses sagged against each other, their windows black and hollowed out. A single street lamp flickered, casting jagged shadows across the cracked pavement. Mia parked near what looked like an abandoned general store, its sign dangling by a thread, Grayson's Goods. Her last name. A coincidence, surely. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped out, the air thick with the scent of rotting wood and something metallic. Her boots crunched on the gravel as she approached the store. The door hung ajar, swaying slightly despite the stillness. Inside, dust coated everything. Shelves of moldy cans, a counter split down the middle, calendar stuck on October 1983. Her flashlight beam caught something etched into the wood behind the counter. "They hear you breathe." Mia's pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. A faint sound, like a sigh, drifted from the back of the store. She froze, straining to listen. It came again, softer, almost like words forming in the dark. Maya? Her name. Her breath hitched, and the flashlight trembled in her hand. The shadows seemed to shift, stretching toward her, and then silence. She backed toward the door, heart hammering, when something cold brushed her ankle. She yelped, swinging the light down. Nothing, just the empty floor. But as she turned to flee, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Mia clawed at the door, her nails scraping against the splintered wood. It wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing against her chest like a living thing. She spun around, sweeping the flashlight across the room. The shelves loomed taller now, their edges jagged and warped, as if the store itself were twisting. The sigh came again, closer this time, curling around her ears. "Maya, stay." "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. No answer, just the echo of her own words, distorted and mocking. She stumbled toward the counter, searching for anything to pry the door open. Her fingers brushed a rusted crowbar, sticky with something dark. She didn't look too closely. As she hefted it, a low creak sounded from the floorboards behind her. She whirled, the beam catching a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting between the shelves, too fast to track. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She swung the crowbar at the door, with splintering with each strike. On the third blow, it gave way, and she tumbled into the night, the mist swallowing her footsteps. She didn't stop to look back, sprinting toward her car. The keys jangled in her shaking hands as she fumbled with the lock. The engine sputtered to life, and she floored it, tires spinning on the gravel. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the trees pressing in tighter. She glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The reflection didn't show the road behind her. It showed the store's interior, the shelves, the counter, and a figure standing there, tall, impossibly thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face was a blur, but its eyes, two hollow pits, locked onto hers through the glass. The car swerved as she screamed, nearly veering into a ditch. She slammed on the brakes, tires screeching. The mirror flickered, the image vanishing, leaving only the empty road. Her chest heaved as she gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady herself. Then from the woods, a chorus of whispers rose, dozens of voices overlapping, calling her name. They weren't just sounds. They vibrated in her skull, pulling at her thoughts. She clapped her hands over her ears, but it didn't stop. And then beneath the whispers, a single, clear voice. "You can't leave." "Not yet." The car's headlights dimmed, then died, plunging her into darkness. Mia sat in the pitch-black car, the whispers clawing at her sanity. The air grew frigid, her breath fogging in front of her. She tried the ignition again. Nothing. The battery was dead, or something worse had drained it. The voices swelled, a cacophony of pleas and threats. "Stay." No. She couldn't tell if they were outside or inside her head. Desperate, she grabbed the flashlight and crowbar, shoving the door open. The mist coiled around her legs like tendrils as she staggered into the night. The road was gone, replaced by a carpet of wet leaves and twisted roots. The forest had swallowed the town, or maybe it had never been there. She swung the flashlight wildly, its beams slicing through the fog. The trees leaned inward, their bark etched with faint, spiraling patterns that pulsed like veins. She ran, branches snagging her jacket, until she stumbled into a clearing. At its center stood a gaping hole, an old well, its stone rim crumbling and slick with moss. The whispers surged, pouring from the depths. "Man, down here." She edged closer, drawn by a pull she couldn't resist. The flashlight beam plunged into the well, revealing slick walls that glistened with something red. At the bottom, barely visible, lay a pile of bones, human, animal, she couldn't tell, and something else. A glint of metal. Her uncle's watch. A sob escaped her. She'd found him, or what was left of him. But before she could process it, the ground trembled. The moss around the well writhed, splitting apart as thin, pale hands erupted from the earth. They clawed upward, dozens of them, attached to emaciated arms that stretched toward her. The whispers turned to shrieks, and the air filled with the stench of decay. Mia swung the crowbar, smashing one of the hands. It burst into a cloud of ash, but more took its place. She backed away, tripping over a root, and fell hard. The flashlight rolled from her grip, its light spinning across the clearing, illuminating a figure emerging from the well. It was the thing from the mirror, its limbs too long, its head lolling as if unhinged. It didn't walk, it glided, the mist parting around it. And then it spoke, its voice a guttural rasp. "You're home." The figure loomed closer, its hollow eyes boring into Mia's soul. She scrambled backward, the crowbar slipping from her sweat-slicked hands. The ground beneath her pulsed, as if the forest itself were alive, beating with a rhythm that matched her racing heart. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, drowning out her screams. "Home, home, home." The thing from the well reached for her, its skeletal fingers brushing her cheek, icy, wet, and impossibly real. She rolled away, snatching the flashlight as she stumbled to her feet. The beam caught the creature's face for a split second, a grotesque mockery of humanity, its mouth a gaping maw lined with jagged teeth, its skin peeling like wet paper. Then it vanished, dissolving into the mist. But she felt it watching, waiting. The hands from the ground retreated, sinking back into the earth with a sickening squelch, leaving only silence. Mia's chest heaved as she clutched the flashlight, spinning in circles. The clearing was empty now, the well a black void at its heart. She couldn't stay, not with that thing, not with the bones, not with her uncle's watch glinting like an accusation. She ran, plunging into the trees, the mist thickening until she could barely see her own hands. Branches lashed her face, drawing blood, but she didn't stop. She had to get out. Hours blurred into minutes, or maybe it was the other way around. Time felt warped, slippery. The forest stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers that followed her every step. Then through the haze, she saw it, a flicker of light. A house. Its windows glowed faintly, warm and inviting, a beacon in the nightmare. She staggered toward it, hope flaring despite the dread gnawing at her gut. The door creaked open before she could knock. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and the faint tang of mildew. A single lamp burned on a rickety table, casting long shadows across peeling wallpaper. Photos lined the walls, black and white images of stern faces, all with her eyes, her nose, her jawline. Grayson's, dozens of them, staring at her from the past. At the far end of the room, a staircase spiraled downward, its steps swallowed by darkness. Footsteps echoed from below, slow, deliberate. Mia gripped the crowbar, her knuckles white. The whispers returned, softer now, almost tender. "Welcome, daughter." A figure ascended, its silhouette distorted by the flickering light. It was Uncle Elias, or what was left of him. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and milky, his lips curled into a smile that didn't reach them. In his hand, he held a leather-bound book, its cover stained with the same dark smear as his letter. "Mia," he rasped, his voice a dry wind. "You've come to finish it." Before she could respond, the walls shuddered, and the photos began to bleed, crimson rivulets dripping onto the floor, pooling around her feet. Mia's scream caught in her throat as the blood pooled higher, lapping at her ankles. The room tilted, the walls groaning as if the house were breathing. Uncle Elias, or the thing wearing his skin, stepped closer, his milky eyes glinting with something ancient and hungry. The book in his hands trembled, its pages fluttering open on their own, revealing script that writhed like living worms. The whispers surged again, a chorus of voices she now recognized. Her mother's soft lilt, her grandfather's gruff bark, and others, generations of Graysons, calling her to join them. What are you?" Mia stammered, raising the crowbar. Her voice sounded small, swallowed by the growing hum emanating from the book. Elias tilted his head, his smile widening until it split his face unnaturally. "I'm the keeper," he said. "And you're the key." He thrust the book toward her, and the air between them rippled. The blood on the floor surged upward, coiling around her legs like vines, pulling her toward the staircase. She swung the crowbar, but it passed through him as if he were smoke, clattering uselessly against the wall. The pull was relentless. She clawed at the floorboards, nails splintering, but the blood dragged her down the stairs, step by creaking step. The light from the lamp faded, replaced by a sickly green glow rising from below. The whispers became a chant, rhythmic and guttural, vibrating in her bones. "Bind her, free us, bind her, free us." At the bottom, the staircase opened into a cavernous chamber. The walls were carved with the same spiraling pattern she'd seen on the trees, pulsing with that eerie light. In the center stood a stone altar, its surface stained black and etched with claw marks. Above it hovered a tear in the air, a jagged rift, like a wound in reality, leaking tendrils of shadow that writhed toward her. The blood released her, and she collapsed, gasping, as Elias descended the final step. "This is Hollow's End," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Our family's legacy. We fed it, kept it sleeping. But it's waking now, and it needs you." He opened the book wider, and the shadows from the rift lunged, wrapping around her wrists. She thrashed, but they tightened, pulling her toward the altar. Her flashlight lay abandoned near the stairs, its beam flickering wildly, revealing, for a moment, the truth. The chamber was filled with bones, hundreds of them, stacked in grotesque piles. Skulls grinned at her, their eye sockets glowing faintly. Elias raised a dagger, its blade curved and stained, above her chest. "Your blood," he whispered, to seal the pact. The shadows tightened, pinning her down, and the rift pulsed, a low growl rumbling from its depths. She felt it then, a presence vast and ancient, stirring behind a tear, its gaze locking onto her. And then, from the rift, a single, clear word, "Mine." The dagger gleamed in Elias's trembling hand, its edge catching the sickly green light as it hovered above Mia's chest. Her body strained against the shadowy tendrils, but they held her like iron, pressing her into the cold stone of the altar. The rift above pulsed faster, its growl deepening into a roar that shook the chamber. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the bones rattled in their piles, clattering as if alive. The presence behind the tear pressed against her mind, a suffocating weight that whispered promises of oblivion. Elias stopped. Mia screamed, her voice raw. "You don't have to do this." He paused, his milky eyes flickering with something. Regret, maybe, or fear. "I didn't choose this," he rasped. "None of us did. The Hollow takes what it wants. It's taken us all, piece by piece. You're the last." His grip tightened on the dagger, and he plunged it downward. Instinct kicked in. Mia twisted, wrenching one arm free as the blade grazed her shoulder, slicing through fabric and flesh. Pain seared through her, but adrenaline surged harder. She kicked out, catching Elias in the chest. He stumbled back, the book slipping from his grasp and hitting the floor with a thud that echoed like thunder. The shadows loosened, recoiling as if startled, and she rolled off the altar, landing hard on the bone-strewn ground. The rift shrieked, a sound that clawed at her eardrums, and the shadows lashed out again, not at her, but at Elias. They wrapped around him, lifting him into the air. His body jerked, limbs bending at impossible angles, and his scream cut off as his form dissolved into ash, scattering across the chamber. The book flared, its pages igniting with green flame, and the air grew thick with the stench of burning leather and something fouler. Mia scrambled for the flashlight, her blood-slicked hand slipping on the handle. She swung the beam toward the rift, and for the first time, she saw it clearly, a massive eye lidless and glistening, staring through the tear. It wasn't just watching, it was emerging. The edges of the rift cracked wider, stone splintering as a clawed limb, black, segmented, and dripping with ichor, pushed through, clawing at the altar. She ran, her boots crunching on bones as she bolted for the stairs. The chamber trembled, walls collapsing inward, and the whispers turned to wails. "Stay, finish. Mine." The stairs buckled beneath her, but she clawed her way up, the green light chasing her heels. She burst into the house, the wallpaper now fully drenched in blood, the photos shattered on the floor. The front door hung open, the mist beyond swirling violently. She didn't stop. She sprinted into the forest, the ground quaking as the presence broke free behind her. Trees snapped like twigs, and a shadow loomed over the canopy, towering, multi-limbed, its eye fixed on her. The air pulsed with its voice. "You cannot run." And then the ground split open beneath her feet, swallowing her whole. Mia plummeted into darkness, the earth closing above her like a trapdoor. Her scream echoed, swallowed by the void as she fell, the flashlight spinning out of her grasp. It tumbled alongside her, its beam slicing through the black, illuminating jagged walls of dirt and stone that glistened with something alive, veins of that same pulsing, spiraling pattern she'd seen before. The air was damp, suffocating, thick with the reek of rot and sulfur. She braced for impact, but it never came. The fall stretched impossibly long, as if she were sinking into something deeper than the earth itself. Finally, she landed, not on solid ground, but in a shallow pool of warm, viscous liquid. It clung to her skin, soaking through her clothes, and when she scrambled to her feet, her hands came away stained red. Blood. The flashlight bobbed nearby, half submerged, its light dim but enough to reveal her surroundings. She stood in a vast, cavernous expanse, its ceiling lost in shadow. The floor rippled beneath her, a sea of crimson stretching to the horizon, dotted with islands of bone and twisted, petrified trees. The walls, if they could be called that, throbbed, fleshy and alive, studded with glowing eyes that tracked her every move. The silence was worse than the whispers. It pressed against her eardrums, heavy and expectant. She retrieved the flashlight, its beam trembling as she swept it across the nightmare landscape. In the distance, something moved, a ripple in the blood, a shadow beneath the surface. Her breath hitched. She backed away, her boots sinking into the mire when the surface erupted. A figure rose, humanoid but wrong. Its limbs too long, its torso twisted, its head a mass of writhing tendrils where a face should have been. It glided toward her, silent and relentless, leaving a wake of ripples. Mia turned to run, but the blood thickened, grasping at her legs like hands. More figures emerged, Dozens of them, their tendrils snapping in the air, their eyeless gazes fixed on her. They didn't speak, but she felt their intent: hunger, possession, eternity. She swung the flashlight like a club, smashing the nearest figure. It dissolved into a spray of ash and ichor, but the others closed in, their tendrils brushing her arms, her neck, her face, cold, slick, invasive. Panic clawed at her chest. She stumbled onto one of the bone islands, the brittle remains crunching beneath her. There, half buried, lay a shard of stone etched with the same spiraling runes. It pulsed faintly, warm to the touch. Instinctively, she grabbed it, and the figures recoiled, hissing as if burned. The cavern shook, a low growl rumbling from the depths. The blood surged, waves crashing against the island, and the eyes on the walls blinked in unison. From the center of the sea, a shape began to rise, massive, incomprehensible, its limbs coiling like serpents, its single eye blazing with malevolent light. The presence from the rift. It towered over her, its voice a thunderclap that split her skull. "You hold the seal. Break it or be broken." The shard burned in her hand, its runes glowing brighter, and the figures lunged again, tendrils outstretched. The shard seared Mia's palm, its heat radiating up her arm as the runes pulsed in time with her heartbeat. The figures closed in, their tendrils snapping inches from her face, but they didn't touch her. The massive entity loomed closer, its eye a furnace of green fire, its serpentine limbs churning the blood sea into a frenzy. The air crackled with its presence, a weight that pressed her to her knees atop the bone island. Its voice boomed again, shaking the cavern. "Break it. Free me. Or drown in the hollow forever." Mia's vision blurred, tears mixing with the sweat and blood streaking her face. The shard trembled, its glow intensifying, and she felt it, a pull, connection. It wasn't just a piece of stone. It was a fragment of something ancient, something tied to her, to the Graysons, to this nightmare. The whispers returned, faint but insistent, threading through the chaos. "End it, save us, break it," her family's voices, pleading from beyond the grave. She looked at the entity, its form shifting, now a towering colossus of shadow and bone, now a writhing mass of eyes and claws. It wasn't just a monster, it was the hollow itself, the heart of the curse that had devoured her bloodline. The shard was the key, the seal keeping it bound, and her last chance. But breaking it, what would that unleash? The figures pressed closer, their tendrils coiling around her legs, tugging her toward the blood. She swung the shard instinctively, slicing through one. It shrieked, dissolving into ash, and the others hesitated. The entity roared, a sound that shattered the petrified trees around her, sending splinters raining down. "Choose," it bellowed, and the sea surged, a tidal wave of crimson crashing toward her. Mia clutched the shard tighter, her mind racing. If she broke it, she might destroy the hollow, or set it free to consume everything beyond the forest. If she didn't, she'd be trapped here, another lost soul feeding its hunger. The wave towered above her, seconds from impact. She raised the shard, its light blinding, and made her choice. With a scream, she drove it into the bone beneath her, not breaking it but embedding it deep. The runes flared, a shockwave of energy erupting outward. The wave froze mid-crash, the figures disintegrated, and the entity howled, a sound of rage and pain that split the cavern walls. Cracks spiderwebbed upward, light piercing through from above. The blood receded, draining into unseen depths, and the eyes on the walls dimmed, one by one. Mia collapsed, gasping, as the island trembled. The entity thrashed, its form unraveling, tendrils snapping apart like frayed ropes. "You've only delayed me," it snarled, its voice fading. The hollow endures, then it sank, swallowed by the abyss, leaving silence in its wake. Above, the cracks widened, revealing a sliver of gray sky. The forest. A way out. Mia dragged herself toward the light, her body screaming in protest, when the ground shuddered one last time. From the shadows, a single tendril lashed out, wrapping around her ankle and pulled. The tendril yanked Mia back, her fingers clawing at the bone-strewn ground as the sliver of sky shrank above her. The shard's light flickered in the distance, still embedded in the island, its glow weakening. She kicked wildly, her boot connecting with the slick, sinewy thing gripping her ankle. It tightened, cutting into her skin, and dragged her toward the abyss where the entity had vanished. The air thickened with its fading growl, "You belong to me." Panic fueled her strength. She twisted, lunging for a jagged bone protruding from the ground, a femur, brittle but sharp. She gripped it like a dagger and stabbed downward, piercing the tendril. It spasmed, releasing her with a wet screech, and she scrambled free, her breath ragged. The cavern groaned, chunks of the fleshy ceiling collapsing into the receding blood sea. She didn't look back. She ran, her legs burning, toward the shard. The light from above pulsed faintly, a lifeline in the chaos. She reached the island, wrenching the shard from the bone with a sickening crack. Its warmth surged through her hand, steadying her trembling limbs. The tendril didn't return, but the cavern was disintegrating, walls caving in, the ground splitting beneath her. She sprinted for the cracks, leaping over fissures as they yawned wider, the abyss snapping at her heels. The shard glowed brighter, guiding her. She climbed, using roots and broken stone as handholds, the sky growing closer. Her shoulder throbbed where Elias's dagger had cut her, blood soaking her sleeve, but she pushed through the pain. The whispers were gone, replaced by the howl of wind from above. With a final heave, she pulled herself through the widest crack, tumbling onto wet leaves and cold earth. She lay there, chest heaving, staring at the gray dawn breaking over the forest. The mist was thinner now, the trees less menacing, their spiraling patterns faded to scars. The shard pulsed once more in her hand, then dimmed, its runes dull and lifeless. Hollow's End was silent. No whispers, no shadows, no presence. Just an empty, broken town in the distance, its houses sagging under the weight of years. Mia staggered to her feet, clutching the shard. Her car was gone, swallowed by the forest or the hollow, but the roads stretched ahead, faint but real. She limped toward it, the weight of survival pressing down on her. The nightmare was over, or so she thought. As she reached the rusted Hollow's End sign, a faint sound stopped her cold. A sigh, soft and distant, carried on the wind. Maya. She spun, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The shard remained dark, inert. Her pulse raced. Was it her imagination? Exhaustion? Or had the hollow left something behind? Something waiting? She turned and ran, the sigh fading into the rustle of leaves, but the unease clung to her like a second skin. The road stretched on, and behind her, the forest watched,